Hello, welcome to Legalese. I'm attorney Christopher Lilly. I'm the host of the program. I'm joined today by Judge Robert W. Gardner, Jr. Robert, Bob, thank you for joining us. Bob was sitting on the Clinton District Court for 17 and a half years. He was appointed as the first justice there in 2001. And served there till 2018, in which he retired. Bob may be known to many as an attorney who started out in air. Actually, before I was myself practicing in air, and I thought it would be good to present to you the career of a judge from the point of view of a judge who starts his practice in the legal community. Our legal community, and what gets involved in that, and how the judge's career, and this case, Judge Gardner's career, developed. Judge Gardner, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Mr. Lilly. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Now, I think I first met you at a trial that you were having against my dad when I was in law school, in the federal district court. Before Judge William Young.
Yes.
And you were the town council for the town of Air at that time.
I was, yes.
And maybe you can give us some of the background of your career as a lawyer prior to becoming judge.
Well, I started practicing law in 1975. I was admitted to the bar, and I opened up my office in Air, and I had a lot of help from your father and Jack Lorden and the Holdens. And the Larkins and a lot of the old-time attorneys. And in those days, although there wasn't usually any type of apprenticeship, and not there is now, but the older lawyers would give you some guidance and help. And then the local judges were also very kind. Judge David B. Williams and Judge Arthur Williams, they were very kind to young attorneys for some guidance. Carl Black, of course, and Charlie Lesser. I really had a lot of help from a lot of the older attorneys when I first started, but particularly my cousin Jack Lorden, who unfortunately just passed away this past May of 2018, actually. So it's been a little over a year now. But
Jack was a mentor to me as well.
Yeah, Jack was a mentor to a lot of people. He really was a great fellow, and and a better cousin and a better fellow. Yeah. So a great guy. So, but I appreciate that. I actually was appointed in 2001 as the Associate Justice in the Clinton Court, and then Judge Brennan, passed away untimely about 6 years ago, and I was elevated to the first justice, and I finished out my career there. But throughout my career, I sat in Clinton, obviously frequently. I sat throughout Worcester County. I sat in the Air Court with some regularity. And some of the other courts, I sat in Lowell pretty frequently too, and whatever. So I got around a lot, and it was very enjoyable. I loved the job, and I worked right up until the very last day, because there's a mandatory retirement at age 70. So everybody can calculate how old I am, 71 and a half. But I worked right up until the last day that I was still 70 before I turned 71 on my before I turned 70 on my 70th birthday, of course, and had to retire. So, but I really enjoyed it.
So now you described the situation where you kind of came out to a fraternity of attorneys, and maybe fraternity is not the right word, but a community of attorneys that were centrally located in the town of Air. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I mean, in those days, of course, the Air Court had just been recently constructed where it stands now in 1969, 1970. That was 1975, and I actually was doing a lot of work in I worked with my cousin and another attorney as a law clerk and whatever, so going back to 73. But in those days, it seemed like Air was sort of the hub for a lot of commerce, a lot of business, similar to what it is probably today. And most of the attorneys congregated in Air to be close to the courthouse, and so they were all up and down the main street, and it just gave me an opportunity to meet with a lot of them. And in those days, as a younger attorney, you'd take your file and you'd call up the lawyer and say, "Can I come over and discuss this case with you at, say, 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon?" And they'd open the doors and be more than welcome to sit and chat with you. And
still do that to some extent.
well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. But it truly was. I think it really was sort of a fraternity. I mean, the attorneys wouldn't roll over and die for you or relative to their case just because you're a local attorney. But there was a certain collegiality that is very evident in those days, and hopefully it still is now. Of course, I haven't practiced in about 19 years since I became a judge.
So when you were practicing 19 years ago, what were you concentrating in?
Well, in those days, just before I became a judge, I had done a lot of criminal work in the past, criminal defense work, and I still was doing some, but I did a lot of land use, a lot of real estate law, some banking law. I mean, candidly, being a small town attorney was really a great benefit to me because it gave me the opportunity to have a very varied practice with a variety of clients and a variety of individuals and problems. There was never a dull moment. And I also was licensed in New Hampshire, and I had an office up there briefly for about 5 years when I first started to practice. But I still had some cases up in New Hampshire. And of course, the law was very similar, but different enough that you always had to look it up and make sure you refreshed yourself. But and a whole different set of judges, a whole different set of lawyers. But it was interesting. I mean, I really considered going back to the practice of law, and I still think about it. But I had some health issues shortly after I got out of working as a judge, and I'm sort of getting over all those and whatever. So it all kind of worked out.
You're doing well now.
Hopefully, I'm doing well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
How long were you town council for?
I was town council in the town of Air for 18 years, and that was an extraordinarily wonderful opportunity. I worked with a lot of individuals, and I rather than try to name all of them or some of them, I don't want to leave anybody out, but it really was a wonderful position, and it gave me the opportunity to work with all facets of municipal law. In that case you alluded to with your dad, that was a civil rights violation case in which there was a reverend that brought a Section 1983 claim against the town, not related to the air. That's the section of the federal code. And we tried that before Judge Young for about 2 weeks, as I recall. And interestingly enough, both sides ended up settling it while the jury was deliberating. And, I guess it's, all's well that ends well, as the old saying goes. So it all worked out. So.
I ended up taking evidence from Judge Young a year later.
Yes, he was a
tremendous teacher.
A phenomenal fellow, and I had an opportunity as a judge to sit in a lot of his evidence, continuing legal education for judges, and he was a tremendous lecturer. And during the instructions to the jury, I remember he stood up, and it seemed without any notes whatsoever, he charged the jury. And to charge the jury essentially means, for the lay people out there, it's when the judge instructs the jury, I know you know this, but when the judge instructs the jury as to the law that applies to this particular case and the alleged facts. And of course, the jury has the opportunity and the duty to find the facts and apply the law as the judge has instructed them to do so relative to the case. But it's very interesting. Yeah.
He was able to do it just off the top of his head.
Pretty much so. Yeah, he's a phenomenal fellow. Phenomenal fellow.
So, what went into your decision to become a judge?
Well, it sort of grew throughout a course of time, and I practiced law, as I said, for 26 years in the town of Air, and I had an opportunity, during those 26 years to have, as I say, a varied practice, but in state court and federal court, and I had a lot of trials, and I had the exposure before a lot of different judges, and I realized that, it's something that I would like to do, and to be the judge really gives you the opportunity to help out a lot of people. Of course, as a practicing attorney, you help out, I think, a lot of people. I always felt like I did. Yeah. And but many times you have one side that you have to argue or you have to advocate for or whatever. And to be the judge really gave you an opportunity to step back from the partisan side of advocating for one client or the other client and try to get to the nub of the matter. And, you know, when I first sat on the bench back in 2001, there was a lot of criminal cases, a lot of civil cases. And what seemed to happen over the course of those 17 years is there was a lot of different situations involving people in need of services. And we call it sections, but it probably wasn't 3 or 4 days that didn't go by I didn't have a mother or a father and a grandmother, grandfather, an aunt or uncle wouldn't come in and say, Judge, please save my son or my nephew or my daughter or my granddaughter's life. You know, they're addicted to drugs, particularly heroin and oxys, and it was just a shame what happened.
Yeah.
And it's still, you know, it's still a daily scourge out there. So.
Yeah, it is. It's terrible. The application process, the judicial application process. Can you tell us a little bit give us a little insight into that?
All right. Well, of course, it's probably changed a great deal since I went through it. You got probably close to 19 years ago now, but it was a very lengthy application. As I recall, mine was probably 60 or 70 pages. And they go through all the biographical information that you have, you know, your name, your age, date of birth, where you went to school, et cetera, et cetera. And then they'll ask you, like, what are your 5 most noteworthy cases that you have handled, and what's your 5 last trials, and they want to know the opposing counsel, and they actually would call the opposing counsel, because I'd get a few phone calls from some attorneys that I knew saying, hey, you know, Bob, I just got a call from the Judicial Nominating Council, and, you know, they're investigating to see whether or not, you know, they're going to recommend you. So it's pretty intense, and it's pretty extensive, and
there's an intensive interview process too.
Yeah,
right?
it really is. Yeah, you go through an interview process with the Judicial Nominating Council, and then if you're fortunate enough, which I was, for my name to go up to the governor's office, you'll meet with the governor's chief legal counsel, who in those days was Lenny Lewin, and I met with him, and then you waited and you heard all sorts of rumors. I mean, when they say read the tea leaves, I mean, there was probably a rumor every day. Somebody's heard something, somebody said something or whatever. And frankly, you tried to just put all the rumors aside because, you know, frankly, really nobody knew until, you know, I got the call. And I got the call from the State House to go down and meet with Attorney Lewin, the governor's chief legal counsel. And everybody said, oh, that's great news, you know, that'll be fantastic. And I said, well, I don't know. And at the time, Governor Jane Swift was the governor. It was her first day back from her maternity leave when she had the twins born. So, you know, I met with Lewin, Attorney Lewin, and he says, I'm going to bring you upstairs, you're going to meet with the governor, and you're going to get appointed to the Clinton District Court.
Wow.
I know, you know.
You weren't expecting that day.
No, I really wasn't, because nobody had really warned me that this was going to happen. So I went up and, you know, we talked briefly, and she said, well, I'm going to appoint you to the Clinton District Court. And I got up and I gave her a big bear hug. And then I said, gee, is it permissible to hug your governor? So, and I'll never forget that.
Supposed to ask that first.
Yeah. So then, of course, Attorney Lewin said, you can't tell anybody until it's officially announced. Oh, and I goes, oh, my goodness. He said, well, just tell your wife and your parents. And I said, well, look, can I tell my dad, because he's in intensive care in the local hospital, and I really would like him to know, because you know, I don't know what's going to happen. But fortunately, I was able to tell him, and most fortunate, you know, he was able to get out of the hospital, and he came to my swearing in and whatever, and he had a nice chat with Governor Swift when he found out she was from a farm in Western Mass, and he talked about how, you know, he grew up on a farm and he had cows and whatever. So he was, I think she liked him more than me. I think at the end of the whole process, she would have changed it to swear him in, so instead of me. So, but that was good. It brings back a lot of great memories. So
now, as associate judge rather than first justice, how do the roles differ?
Well, I mean, the first justice, and back in those days, the first justice had probably more control over the court, the physical activity of the court. And going way, way back, the first justice would hire and fire the probation offices and you know, people in the clerk's office, things of that nature. That's, you know, way back, probably ancient history, back to the 60s and the 70s. But as the associate, you know, I would certainly defer to Judge Brennan. And quite honestly, Clinton pretty much was just a one-judge court. So I would go throughout Worcester County and sit in a lot of the different courts. Of course, Worcester Central District Court, CDC as we'd call it, Uxbridge and Dudley and East Brookfield, and I mean, there was Fitchburg, Leominster, Gardner,
You
Winchester.
tend to move around more as an associate judge.
Yeah, move around a lot as associate judge, which was helpful in the sense that you saw each court, and each court kind of had its own personality, own style. I mean, you'd follow the same law and have the same forms, but there was a certain rhythm to the court, and that was interesting to learn, observe that, and to, you know, you've got to have the opportunity to take the best practices from each court, because although they're following the same law and the law is uniform throughout the state, the courts would do things a little differently, you know, and have different, I mean, they had the same hours, but different schedules and whatever. So I found that very helpful to start out there. The other thing I found very helpful, too, is, and I was living in Worcester at the time, but you know, I still practiced in Ayer in Middlesex County, and of course Worcester County is a whole different county, and I really didn't know a lot of the attorneys there. So when I started sitting as a judge, I mean, they didn't know who I was, and they, you know, were probably making calls to try to, you know, get some reads.
Find out who you were and what you were about.
Pet peeves, things of that nature. I don't know, and I mean, I just tried to, you know, call them as I saw them, and just be right down the middle, you know, not take any sides or whatever, have any predilections. But that helped me, I think, too, being from sort of the outside of the county, so I didn't really have any relationships with, you know, probably 99% of the attorneys. I really didn't know them.
Yeah, I guess that's the luxury of being first associated with Ayer, is you're right on the border with Worcester County, and there is such a difference between the two counties. Yeah,
there really is. I mean, different district attorneys and, you know, different law firms, things of that nature, and whatever. I mean, Ayer, to some extent, you know, there was a pretty good nucleus of attorneys right in the town of Ayer. And you had the Lowell Bar, of course, which is reasonably close by, but you'd have a lot of Boston attorneys and Cambridge attorneys coming out to the Ayer court. In Worcester County, of course, Worcester, the second largest city in the state, you know, would have many of the largest firms outside of Boston, and you know, it was probably more insular from that standpoint. So it was interesting.
Now, you started talking about the section commitments, sections 12 and 35, for the civil commitments of people with either issues with mental health or with drugs, alcohol. As a first newly incoming judge, and then later as a more seasoned judge, what were some of the issues that you found that were affecting this area?
Well, first of all, I mean, there was just a tremendous amount of drugs, and you know, people probably are deluding themselves if they think drugs aren't in their town or their school system or things of that nature, and you know, they seem to almost come up like a pipeline up from, well, I hate to, you know, designate an area, but you know, coming up Route 495 and things of that nature, and you know, certainly coming into the cities, and it just seemed to be an explosion of drugs, and kind of the classic or the typical situation. Of course, it's also well known now, but you'd have a lot of young people that maybe would have sports injuries or perhaps had their wisdom teeth pulled, and you know, I'm not faulting the medical profession, but you know,
the painkillers.
Yeah, they would prescribe painkillers, Oxycontins, things of that nature, and what would happen is a lot of people would get addicted to them. A lot of the younger people would get addicted, and then of course the doctor would say, well, you don't need these anymore, and you shouldn't be taking them. And then the people were addicted, the young people, and they were going to their friends' houses and, you know, raiding their friends' parents' medicine chests, things of that nature, medicine cabinet. And then sort of the classic story is they started to try to buy Oxycontins, Oxycodone on the street, and they find out that heroin is actually less expensive, and it's just a horrific, horrific drug. And I mean, you know, I've talked to a lot of addicts. I've attended a lot of seminars, talked to a lot of halfway houses and detox centers and things of that nature. And they say that probably the second time somebody ingests heroin, that they are hooked. And they're always, as the expression goes, chasing the high. It means they're trying to replicate the high from that drug, and they probably will never replicate it, but they'll always try to do it.
It's a physical dependence.
Yeah, it is a physical dependence, and it just, there's been so many deaths. I mean, it's just had a lot of people that came before me and, you know, passed away at an early age.
Yeah.
It was just so sad. And
people that you knew from being in front of you that...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was just, you know, it was every, not every week, but probably every month.
How does that affect your decision-making process?
Well, I mean, you have to, you know, put aside the personalities or whatever, but, you know, I was very sensitive to when the doctors would come in, the court clinicians come in and would testify and recommend that people need commitment. Now, unfortunately, that's a whole different story, because although we can commit somebody up for up to 90 days, I mean, the beds...
typically not that long.
It's typically not that long, and the beds weren't available. There's not enough facilities. So what would happen is the people would end up being released probably 20, 25, 30 days. And generally speaking, what would happen is they'd go back to their old neighborhood, their old, you know, colleagues, buddies.
Go back to the same environment.
Same environment, yeah, and it would be just difficult to have them escape that. And the other real tragedy is when they would be off the drugs for that period of time, like 20, 25 days or whatever, when they'd come back, many times they'd think they could still take the same amount of drugs, the same dosage that they were taking before they were committed. And, you know, their resistance wasn't as great, and that's when you'd have the overdose, and a lot of deaths resulted. And of course, Narcan is the classic drug now for, you know, bringing people back to life. And a lot of times what would happen when they're brought back to life by the EMTs or the police or even at the hospital, they kind of wake up from this near-death experience, and they're combative, and you know, there's a lot of situations which are very tragic, because you get the people who are literally, you know, reaching down deep and bringing them back to life from death. And I don't mean to sound melodramatic. And then, you know, they want to strike out and hurt the person that's saving their saved their life. So, I mean,
sometimes you hear of them having to revive them more than once.
Oh yeah.
During the course of an evening. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's really just a tragedy to our society. So.
And fentanyl, I guess, is...
yeah, it's become like the new powerful
the new heroin,
drug.
I guess, or the replacement for heroin.
Yeah, so, and that's
just a death drug. So, what are some of the changes that you've seen in the courts during the course of your career as attorney and then judge?
Well, I think there's a lot more continuing legal education going on for the judges and certainly the practicing attorneys, and there's much more responsibility, and there's much more uniformity in the sense of there's a lot of courses. You know, we would typically spend 3 days out in Western Mass for a conference, but you know, we'd stay overnight and would have intensive training. That's where, you know, saw Judge Young one time, you know, lecturing and whatever, and it gave you a lot of interaction with the judges throughout the state too, which was very important. And they've got the resources and the ability to provide these training sessions, not just, you know, once every summer, but you know, there'd be training sessions probably 2 or 3 times a month. Now, you wouldn't go to all of them, but you'd go to a lot of them. It was very helpful. And
as a judge?
You're right, as a judge, and some of the senior judges would, you know, lecture, like Judge Young would lecture at a lot of them and whatever. And it gave you an opportunity to also discuss with other judges how they might handle a situation, you know, given whether it's a section or a eviction or criminal case, things of that nature. And it was interesting, as I said, the law is uniform, but sometimes how things
The
are
application
applied,
may not be so much, yeah.
well, that's true. The application may not necessarily be, totally uniform from, judge.
You'd like it to be, but it is also...
Well, I mean, judges bring their life's experience with them. I mean, you can't put that aside necessarily, and you have to follow the law, and you have to be fair and true to your conscience and do the right thing. But I mean, sometimes, the application, as you say, that's a great word. How you make these decisions and how you sentence. I mean, there's sentencing guidelines that all judges follow, but you still have some latitude, which, I think is fine. I mean, a lot of people nowadays feel that, judges should be just uniform in the sentence, and, everybody should get the first offense, second offense. There should be a lot of minimum mandatories. I mean, I look at it not just because I was a judge for so many years, but there's a lot of faith placed into a person when they get appointed to the bench, and there's a lot of diligence, and there's a lot of introspection, and there's a lot of examination, and if you're willing to put yourself through it all, and you're successful, and you get chosen, I mean, a lot of people have felt that you've got the right aptitude, the right personality, the right demeanor, that you would be able to apply the law fairly and correctly and evenly. And I think back to Attorney Lewin, and he talked about Lewin's Law. He wanted to make sure that you knew you were appointed to the bench and not anointed to the bench. And years ago, probably some of the judges would have like little fiefdoms, and I don't think that's a situation
that doesn't exist anymore. Yeah.
I don't think so. I really don't. I mean, there's so much interaction with the Chief Justice's office, and you have the continuing education for judges and things of that nature. And you got the Judicial Conduct Commission, so you have to, obviously be concerned about. That's for those of you out in TV land, the JCC, Judicial Conduct Commission. If somebody has a complaint, whether it's a litigant or a party or a lawyer or a court employee, they could file a complaint before the Judicial Conduct Commission. I'm happy to say I never had one filed against me.
Good.
So.
Good. So now you're retired as a judge.
Yeah.
What next?
Well, I'm involved in a lot of nonprofits. I mean, I sit with you on the Devon's Enterprise Commission. I'm involved in the Yale Library. I've just been elected as the president of the Board of Trustees. I'm also involved with the Devon's Museum, which we try to sponsor and foster the memory of Fort Devens. Sandy Pond School Association, and I try to stay active in a lot of nonprofits, and also it seems like the older you get, the more doctors you have to see too. So I spend some time doing that. Yeah. Yes. So.
Well, Judge Gardner, I want to thank you for joining us here.
Thank you, Chris.
This has been tremendous.
Well, it's been tremendous for me, and tell your dad I said hi.
I will do that.
I guess we're off.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you all for joining us. This has been Legalese, and catch us next time.